My name's Maggie Nowakowska. I'm from Ohio originally and came to Seattle back in the 70s after I graduated from college. Just about the time they were making Star Trek fan conventions back east. I felt very, very sorry for myself to have moved all the way out here and not be able to go to New York for Star Trek conventions because I was a Star Trek fan. And the Star Trek fandom is what introduced me Star Trek is what introduced me to the concept of fandom. I didn't really know fandom existed because when I went to the library and piled up my science fiction books on the counter, the librarian would look at me and say, "Dear, don't you want to see read some Nurse Barton, or here's some Nancy Drew? Those books are for boys." And this is about the same time, maybe about 10 years later, after Harlan Ellison, who had been a boy in Cleveland, went to the library with his stack of science fiction books, and the librarian said, "Did you know there's a group of boys who get together and talk about science fiction?" And that's basically my background in being exposed to other people reading what I read. My mother and I read science fiction, and that was it. I wrote Star Trek stories, or started to write Star Trek stories in the late 60s when I was in college, but nobody wanted to read them, so I never finished them. I just finished them in my head. And then I read in one of the Star Trek books that there was such a thing as fandom. And people got together, and they published something called zines and fanzines. And I read about Spockanalia, done by Deborah Langsom, which was the first Star Trek fanzine. And I longed to be able to get my hands on one, and it was many years before I figured out how to get my hands on one. But there were small Star Trek groups around the country, star bases they were called. In Seattle was Starbase 12. And I met some of the people. I read about it. I ran out to Ballard, where the house was, where the main woman was who ran it. And they had fanzines there, Star Trek fanzines. And I picked them up, and I looked at them, and I said, "Damn, this is what we've been doing for years for Bonanza." And for a singing group I knew, we wrote stories all through high school and junior high school years. And I said, "Wow, this is great." I took a bunch of them home. I read them. I said, "I can do this. Boy, can I do this." And I started writing letters. I got onto a subscription for a letter zine, a Star Trek letter zine, which was basically like a list, like Facebook is now, where people talked back and forth on subjects, only you wrote letters. And the one particular one, Hulk and Council, that I know the best, came out, I think, bi-monthly. So you would write your letter, send it in, and in 2 months you'd get the issue back where you'd have your letter printed, and you'd read the letters of other people, and you'd get into the rhythm of where 2 months later you'd read answers to your letter. And it would go back and forth. And this was a fairly fast turnaround. We really liked this. This was great. And the letters were long. I've been looking back through some of the old fanzines and fan letter zines, and we're talking 10-point type, 2 or 3 columns they would run if they were an 8.5 by 11, and they'd go on for 2 or 3 pages. And somebody would had sat there and retyped all those letters, and then pasted them up. In the old days, you typed them out, you cut the pages apart, you got the glue, you pasted it on a piece of paper, and then you photocopied them. Or if you were really doing the old fanzines, you did Mimeo. You typed it on the Mimeo, and that was hard to correct when you made a mistake. And the paper, oh gosh, I've got some now, and the paper is so delicate. It practically falls apart in your hands if you handle it too much. If it's been sitting in your box for a while compressed, it stays compressed for a while. But friends would have, their dining room table would be covered with a huge mimeograph machine. And that's how they churn out. It was the cheapest way you could do a zine. When people were paste up, people would do it on their kitchen tables. I know somebody who did it on their kitchen counters. I know somebody who did it in her car because her family didn't really quite understand what she was doing with all this fanish stuff.
So what years are we talking about?
We're talking the 70s. We're into the 70s. Spockanalia came out in 67, and it was put out by women in their 20s. At that time, I would have said these are grown women because I was 17, 18 at the time. And they were the ones who put on the first Star Trek convention. They expected, I think, about 300 people. They got 3,000. But all those first conventions were all put on and run by fans, like the science fiction conventions are these days, because these women had been involved in science fiction. That's why they watched Star Trek. I watched Star Trek because it was science fiction, and it wasn't Outer Limits. It wasn't Monster of the Week. There were people interacting with an alien. That just absolutely fascinated us. It was the first time somebody had presented an alien who had a job and had to figure out how to get along with the other people too. And it helped that Spock was fairly young, and we could identify with his awkwardness to a great extent. But it was for college kids. And speaking of advertising, as we were doing earlier, when Star Trek came out, I hear a lot of fans say, well, Star Trek was so popular. It wasn't. It was popular with college kids. It was popular with RAND scientists. It was popular with engineers, basically people who read science fiction. But it wasn't popular with other people. It was for the kids. I had to sit through an hour of Daniel Boone in order to reserve the TV so I could watch Star Trek after that. Now, granted, there were some very fine-looking people. Ed Ames was easy on the eyes, so I didn't mind it too much. But then I went to another school, and there was no way of getting anywhere near the TV because people were watching other things. I had to find a TV on Frat Row in the Newman Club, which was the Catholic organization, and found a TV down in their basement, and I was the only person sitting there watching Star Trek. Well, there were at least 3 boys every week standing in the hallway, sniggering and laughing.
Why?
Because Star Trek was for geeks. Well, we didn't use nerd. We used the word nerds, eggheads, kids who read all the time, the kids who were good in school, who were boring, and a girl sitting there. At the time, I've got it at home somewhere, Isaac Asimov wrote an article, why are all these women watching Star Trek? Why do these women think Spock is interesting? And he came to the conclusion it must be the ears. And I was naive enough that I didn't get any double entendres out of that. I didn't know about the kind of double entendres guys had for any part of the body. And it was very difficult. Nobody wanted, even my friends who understood why I liked Star Trek, they weren't interested in reading the stories.
Well, I know that they tried to cancel it in the second season.
Oh, yes, yes.
Joe and John Trimble.
Yes, and
were you part of that campaign?
I was not part of that campaign. I didn't know about it until I read about it in the papers because people were so startled. I was at Ohio State at that time, and you just didn't run into anyone. And I was in communications. I wasn't in one of the sciences. Maybe if I had been in one of the sciences, I would have run into more people who were interesting, but I was in communications. And so I just watched it just like I read books by myself. And once I got out here and got involved with the local science fiction, the local Star Trek community, I started going to science fiction cons also, which were a lot of fun because I could talk about the books I read. And we used to have very small mini conventions. There are the Northwest rooms at the Seattle Center, and they're little meeting rooms. They're not the main places people go when they go to events at the Seattle Center. They're the side rooms where they put the smaller interests. George Takei would come up practically every year, and every year this was going to be the year that the Captain Sulu show was. He was talking with the network, and they were going to do it this year or next year for sure. And he's a delightful man to be around. He was just so much fun. And it was 2 or 3 rooms, and we'd go and do the kind of things we now think of you do at cons. But that was all we had. We had one year, I think it was 75, where we took over the meeting rooms at the old Olympic Hotel downtown. Now it's called the Fairmont, I believe. And that was big. We actually had Harlan Ellison come to that convention. David Gerald came to it. He was a big guest because he had wrote Tribble's stories. And he had stayed around. And we raised money, like cons do now. You see all the beginnings of what we now think of as common activities at conventions. And that was fun because that was big time downtown Seattle. I published my first Star Trek fan story in 78. So no, 77. 70 Star Wars came out. And I had another one in the works that came out in 78. But when Star Wars came out, I went to the movie, fell in love with the Millennium Falcon. The other people were interesting too. But I wanted that ship. I could put all my books in that ship and still go from planet to planet, because I could never really figure out how I could fit all my books in a trailer, or a van, so traveling town to town wouldn't work. And that was the summer I spent at UA 150. Every weekend I'd go at least once. It was like going to church, to go and see Star Wars. And through my Star Trek friends, I'm saying, the woman who was printing my Star Trek story said, "You don't by any chance know anybody who's doing a Star Wars fanzine?" And she says, "As a matter of fact." And she introduced me to the editor of Skywalker, which was one of the really premier Star Wars fanzines. It was the fanzine that Gary Kurtz took to 20th Century Fox to prove, this is not going to hurt your bottom line. This is okay. We can live with this. And
the alternative was to cease and desist?
Yeah, well, probably eventually. Because, one of the reasons Star Trek got away with it is that there weren't the kind of copyrights that they could have done on those stories. Somebody, for some reason, didn't do it. So there was a lot of leeway, at least for the first season. And so they had harder arguments in those days, and so fans had a lot of fun. But by the time 1977 came around, Lucas and Kurtz knew about fandom, and everybody was aware of that sort of thing. It's a much more sophisticated audience then. And so we started putting out the very first Star Wars Genzine. Came out in summer of 77, done by a young man, and it was about 8 pages. Had letters, had some little articles, had news about Star Wars, what little people could get, because everybody was still in shock over the popularity of the movie. And then you had groups of fans put out some fan club zines. But the first zines that had stories in them, that continued the Star Wars universe, just like in Trek, new episodes of Star Trek were in the fanzines, they started in the very early months of 78. Because it takes time to write the stories. I finished the stories that I had printed in March and April of 78. I wrote in the end of summer and in the fall of 77. Because it took time to do these things. It wasn't like you didn't go online and put in your story. You wrote your story, you sent it off to an editor, and the editor decided whether she liked it, and then she marked it up and sent it back to you, and you talked back and forth about the markups. The very first story I wanted to place, can we have another scene at the end? And I said, no, that's the end of the story. But we want to know what happens next. I said, fine, write that story. Right at the very beginning, you had the proverbial fanish reaction. I like this story. What happens next? And I wrote the story, and I had been in advertising and radio, and I knew a little bit about writing, so I argued with them about the arc of the story. And we settled all fine. I said, no, I can't write another thing in this, another scene. So they said, fine, we'll give the story back to you. And that took time to do. And then once they got the stories in, and once they got the corrections back, then they had to start typing. Because you couldn't type it in and then put the corrections in like you can, Word and WordPerfect and everything these days. Social dynamics don't change. Human beings have these interactions. Human beings misunderstand each other. Human beings don't like what other human beings are doing. Other human beings get hurt if you say, well, I just don't care for it. And you're often running on an unnecessary argument, because just because you don't care for it doesn't mean it's bad. But yes, we went through all of this. I was looking through Halcon Council when the Slash stories first started showing up, and the initial letters in that letter zine were very polite. This is interesting. It isn't necessarily something I'm interested in, but tell me about why you're doing this very adult interaction. And then about 3 or 4 issues in, the people with the bombs showed up. Oh my God, you can't do that. And the language that's terrible, was very aggressive. And things went downhill from there. Then we ended up with the slash world. We have, basically for many, many decades, because you will always have people who disagree on the subject. I was very surprised when I got on AO3 and started talking to some other people in the slash community that there are still people who don't want their names attached to their stories. And that surprised me, because I didn't write slash. Sex is one thing. I didn't write slash. It just didn't. The fanish kind of putting the two guys together and writing a romantic story. I like action, adventure, and that kind of stuff. Sex comes in when it's necessary for the plot. But it doesn't bother many people who do it.
Even when I first started this project, it was about fanfic. And it was 2012. And I had a very hard time getting people to talk on camera about their fanfic.
And this is what surprised me. We thought...
Yeah, we're gonna...
Oh, sorry.
I was just saying what she was saying was really interesting. We're signing on.
Oh, what time is it?
I'm talking too much.
10:30.
No, you're amazing.
It's amazing. We're finding.
Okay,
we're finding.
Yeah, I mean, I could...
You could give me a call, too. We can do something over the line.
Okay. All right, is there anything else you just want to add?
To end on the note is that don't feel that you're doing something that nobody else understands, because we've been there. Find somebody who's a fan who's a little bit older and talk to them about what it was like to do fandom before the web, and you will see, yes, we had the same arguments. It's not something about that's particular to the way you're acting in fandom. This is people. Fandom may be a family to many people, but remember, an awful lot of families fight. We're a family in that when nobody else will help you, your family will come around you. And in fandom, the same thing works. But that doesn't mean you're going to agree with everybody. I try to relax. It's when you're young, you take everything very, very personally because you're scared. You haven't done this before. But fandom is fandom. And it's been that way as long as I've been in it, and I've been in it since the 70s. It's people. And it's a great way to grow up because you end up getting confidence in what you're doing. And you end up saying, yeah, I do this. And it may take 5 years for some people, 1 year for one people, 10 years for another person. But eventually one day you say, I'm doing this. It's fun. I like it. And I'm going to keep on doing it. I retired 10 years ago, and I've been doing gardening and landscaping for my friends. And then about a year and a half ago, after reading things online, but hearing all this stuff, everybody's saying, oh my God, people, we did that already. You don't have to worry about it anymore. I've gotten back involved, and I'm having a ball. I'm having a lot of fun because I'm rediscovering how much fun I had. It's not the same, but I enjoy it. I just sit back and listen a lot, if you can believe that. But I'm sad because there's still so much hassle out there. We thought we would have taken care of some of the problems. Because we solved the problems in our little group, we thought the problems were solved in the greater group.